So hello and welcome back to Books and Things. As you can see, I have a different background behind me today. That's because I've moved from my normal bookshelf to my Victorian bookshelf slash mantelpiece that is masquerading as a bookshelf. This is my little shrine to the Victorians slash actually just a shrine to Dickens. I have many Dickens books and a picture of Dickens in the background because, you know, it's important to have a picture of your favourite author in your room. Anyway, the reason why I decided to go where there were more Victorian books beside me, including some books that are physically, literally Victorian, is because I'm going to talk about the Victorians today. I want to talk about the Victorians much more on this channel. I'm going to be talking about them a lot in the future, so yay, aren't you all looking forward to that? So on the video that was one half of my October wrap-up, in which I spoke about all the Victorian novels I read in October, Amanda Centre, whose brilliant booktube channel I will link down below, said that she would like to see me do some videos about Victorian literature and how I kind of got into it, and in general just my experience with Victorian literature, and I thought, yes, I want to do that. I want to do a lot of videos about Victorian literature because it is my favourite period to read about and I love so many authors from the Victorian times. This video is kind of an introduction to a series I'm going to start called How to Speak Victorian because I thought of the name and then thought it was silly and then I couldn't think of anything else and I just thought I'd go there. So yes, welcome to How to Speak Victorian with Katie Lumsden. I'm going to talk about the Victorians a lot. So in this video I just wanted to briefly talk about how I got into Victorian literature and my kind of reading experience of Victorian literature. Then next time I will do a video about like historical context of the Victorian period, and then I'll do one about like the key literary movements of the time and the key literary figures and like the key kind of literary themes, the themes that turn up again and again in various different Victorian literature. I hope that sounds interesting. Let me know if it does. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you will know two things. One, that I absolutely love Victorian literature, and two, that until about 6 weeks ago I'd given it up for a year. Over my masters I did not read any Victorian literature because I thought it was about time. I kind of read some other things because between the ages of about 13 and 20 I read nothing but Victorian literature, and then over my degree I read some modern stuff and some Victorian literature, and then by the time I'd got to 21, 22 I just thought, you know what, no, I need to have a year off. So I did, but I'm back and I've missed it and I love it. Anyway, I got into Victorian literature when I was 13 years old and I saw this TV adaptation of Jane Eyre. I watched the first episode of this with my parents when I was in year 9, so I must have been about 13, and I remember just thinking it was brilliant, and then someone in school said something about the fact that there was a woman hiding in the attic, and I was like, no, I don't believe that, that can't be true. But it was another week until I would get to find out what was actually going on, and so I read the book. My mum happens to also really like Victorian literature, and so she gave me Jane Eyre and encouraged me to read it, and I did read it. I finished the book, I think possibly before the second episode had started, and definitely before the series had finished, and I absolutely loved it. And after watching this and reading Jane Eyre, I just felt like I discovered something that I wanted to know more about. And once my mum discovered that I enjoyed this TV adaptation of Jane Eyre, she decided to share with me many other glorious TV adaptations of 19th century literature. So I saw like the BBC Pride and Prejudice and the BBC Our Mutual Friend and the BBC North and South, and watching and loving these TV adaptations I also started to read and love the books. Again, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that Our Mutual Friend is my favourite book, but I actually saw the TV adaptation of it before I read the book. The same goes for North and South and Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I mean, I know Jane Austen isn't Victorian, but it's of the 19th century. And I kind of got into Jane Austen about the same time as I got into all my favourite Victorian authors. So I kind of discovered the bare bones of 19th century literature through watching TV adaptations and being intrigued enough to pick up the book. There were several like Jane Eyre that I watched the first episode of the TV series of and then decided to go and read the book. The same happened with Little Dorrit and I think probably one or two others. And once I'd read a few books that I'd seen TV adaptations of, I gradually began to like extend my reading beyond just stuff I'd also watched and read a lot of other books by authors that I'd already read some books of. So I read a lot more Dickens, I read a lot more of the Brontes. After seeing the TV series of He Knew Who Was Right, I began to read Anthony Trollope. I then read Tess the D'Urbervilles because my mum had recommended it and went on to discover lots of Hardy. I discovered that there was a TV adaptation of The Moonstone, so I read The Moonstone and then I watched that, and I just kept on discovering 19th century literature, both through discovering new authors but also through seeing new TV adaptations of 19th century literature and therefore discovering more Victorian authors that way. I think I was quite lucky both in that my mum is quite into Victorian literature and could recommend me lots of stuff, and also that when I was a teenager in the 2000s it was like the heyday of TV costume dramas. There were so many, like every Sunday night I swear there was one, and you know there was Cranford and there was Little Dorrit and there was Bleak House and there was Jane Eyre and North and South, and so many that just don't seem to be on TV at the moment anymore, which makes me really sad. Like, I haven't seen a good TV adaptation of a Victorian novel for years now. I don't know where they've gone. Maybe it's a recession thing, I don't know. Maybe there's not the money for them. Or maybe it's just Downton. I blame Downton. It's taken away all my favourite TV things anyway. So from the age of 13 onwards, I just began to read obsessively these 19th century novels, and I began to get so involved in that Victorian world and just love the style of those novels. One of the things I think I really loved is that 19th century novels were so big, and I loved that, especially because I went from reading sort of kids' fantasy to reading Victorian literature, and in kids' fantasy a lot of the time I was reading series, and I really enjoyed getting into those really big chunky stories, and you get the same in Victorian literature in that you have like a 1,000-page novel. There is so much there to devour, which I just love. And then when I was 16, in the summer between my GCSEs and my A-levels, I went to summer school for a week because I was a very cool teenager. The summer school I went to is run by Canterbury Christ Church University, and there were a lot of different courses going on, and the one I was doing was an English course, and basically it was all about Victorian literature. It was a week of Victorian literature and history and the way that the history influenced the literature and just so many wonderful things, and this week had a massive impact on me. Not only did it help me discover even more Victorian writers, but it was the week in my life when I think I realised that I wanted to do English and history at university, because up until that point I had thought I was going to do maths at university for some obscene reason, and then after that course I realised that even though I was technically better at maths, what I really loved was English, and I really loved reading books, and I really loved history and how history changes books. The first time I ever properly studied any Victorian literature was when I was in year 13. As part of my English literature A-level, we had a module on the Gothic in which we studied Paradise Lost, which is pre-Gothic and isn't Gothic, and The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, which is brilliant, and Dracula, which is Victorian but I hate, and Wuthering Heights, which I love. I'd read Wuthering Heights before. I think I'd read it when I was about 14, 15 when I was doing my GCSEs, and then I got to study it at A-level and I loved it, which was brilliant. Studying Wuthering Heights was amazing, and so great to just study a book that I loved and to delve that far into it, and I just had a wonderful time studying Wuthering Heights. The other Victorian literature I got to write on during my A-levels was for my year 13 coursework. We were basically allowed to pick whatever we wanted. We had to do 2 essays and we could do them on anything we wanted. One of them had to be comparative and the other one we had to use literary theory, although in year 13 what we thought was literary theory wasn't actually literary theory. I wrote my literary theory essay on Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South and about like class conflict and Marxist ideology in it, etc. And then I wrote my other essay as a comparative between Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, looking at how like marriage is presented differently in them, which I loved, and which, to be honest, kind of went on to influence a lot what I did my dissertation on 3 years later, because I just found writing about like gender and marriage in Victorian literature so fascinating. Just, yeah, so, it was good times. Anyway, I then went on to study quite a lot of Victorian literature at university as well. My first year I studied Jane Eyre and Bleak House as part of our kind of history of the novel course, and then in second year I did an English module called Landscape and the Condition of England, where we looked at like a lot of 19th and 20th century literature and how they reflected kind of social issues going on at the time, which I just loved. My degree was not just in English, it was in English, literature and history joint honours. I also did a module in second year that was just on 19th century social history, in which I managed to write about quite a lot of novels in my essays, which is quite cool. I did a history essay that counted towards the history half of my degree that was about the rise of the novel and how the novel changed over time in the 19th century. That was just the best. It made me happy. Then in third year I got to do a module on Victorian literature. I also got to do a module on the French Revolution, which obviously isn't Victorian, but I got to write an essay on Tale of Two Cities, which is Charles Dickens' Victorian novel looking back on the French Revolution, which was so much fun. And then I also got to do my dissertation. I did a double module dissertation, so 12,000 words, all about Dickens. So I wrote about how the presentation of gender in Dickens' novels changes over time. So I believe my title was, so it begins with a quote, which is, "The males turned pale and the females fainted, changing presentations of gender in Charles Dickens," which I had so much fun with. I wrote about the Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby, Martin Chuzzlewit, Dombey and Son, Little Dorrit, Bleak House and Our Mutual Friend. Is that too many? No, that's 7, yeah. But I wrote about 7 novels, and I wrote about how the presentation of femininity and masculinity changes over time, like from Dickens' early novels to his later novels, and that was great. That was great fun. So with my dissertation and the essay I wrote on Hard Times for Landscape and Condition of England, and the essay I wrote on Tale of Two Cities for my French Revolution module, I managed to write about 9 out of 14 of Dickens' novels over my degree. which I am pretty proud of. And then once I'd finished my degree, I gave up 19th century literature for a year. That was hard, because I do love it, but I do think it was for the best. I think it probably helped my writing to read a lot more modern literature, and I think it probably also helped like my career prospects. I now feel like I'm much more aware of the kind of books that are being published now than just the kind of books that were being published in the Victorian period. But I've now decided that it's okay to strike a balance, and I'm reading Victorian literature, and I'm reading contemporary literature, and I'm reading literature from the time in between. But at the same time, I still feel like the thing I know most about within literature is Victorian literature. I have read quite a lot and I do love it, and I'd like to talk about it more. So this was just an introduction to how I got into Victorian literature and like my journey with Victorian literature. Please let me know what you thought down below and what you would like me to talk about to do with Victorian literature, because I'm definitely going to do more in these series and talk in a lot more depth about actual stuff to do with Victorian literature rather than just my general love of it. So I will see you in a few days' time. In the meantime, happy reading, and I hope you pick up something Victorian soon.